I'm with Abraham Sanchez of New Mexico CAFé. Their website is organizenm.org. Abraham, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed by our Las Cruces. And before we get started with New Mexico CAFé, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for having me, Gary. My name is Abraham Sanchez. As you said, I work for New Mexico CAFé. And so I am born and raised in Las Cruces, New Mexico, actually. I don't know anything else other than this wonderful place. I've not thought much about leaving here because I love this community. I attended elementary school and middle school and high school and college all here. I'm a Las Cruces Bulldog and I'm an Aggie as well. I studied at New Mexico State University. Yeah, I studied government. And so a few years back, I actually began working for local government. I worked for Doña Ana County with the Bureau of Elections. And so it was very much through that work that I was able to kind of look through this window into some larger work of organizing, and got to meet some of the people who have worked for CAFé in the past, as well as some of the folks who currently work there, and was just able to get a lot better orientation as to what this work is and the ways that you're able to hopefully move policy and make quality of life better for people in southern New Mexico.
Thank you. Can you explain a little bit about the founding history and mission and purpose of New Mexico CAFé?
Sure. So New Mexico CAFé stands for New Mexico Comunidades en Acción y de Fe. So it's communities in action and of faith. We do faith-based community organizing for social and economic and racial justice in southern New Mexico. CAFé is currently in its 11th year. So it was founded 11 years ago by Sarah Silva. Is her name. She's also a very integral community member here as well, and we honor her. At the time, it was very much started in partnership with some folks who were part of the Catholic Church, and I believe even the bishop at the time, Ricardo, he saw the need for organizations like this to exist in a community like ours. Obviously, there is a strong element of social justice in the Catholic faith tradition, including things like liberation theology and so on. And so that's a lot of kind of the starting point for New Mexico CAFé in this community. And so, yeah, that's the founding of it, at least.
So how is it funded?
Yeah, so, and if you can forgive me if I don't know all of the specifics, that's not necessarily, that's a little bit above my pay grade, but New Mexico CAFé is funded by large endowments, like a lot of other nonprofit organizations, as well as different grant funding that we receive for different projects we might be working on, as well as individual private donations that we are always happy to accept as well.
Gotcha. And so is it a 501c3 organization?
Yes. So New Mexico CAFé is a 501c3.
Okay. And do they have an annual report online somewhere, or is it under New Mexico CAFé, or?
That's actually a really good question. I would imagine possibly with the New Mexico Secretary of State's office, if not with the IRS. Obviously, New Mexico CAFé, like any other nonprofit, is subject to the different laws and requirements for nonprofits. And so I do believe every nonprofit has to be registered with the Secretary of State's office. I'm not sure if that's where you'd be able to access those reports.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you tell me a little bit about how a faith-based organization is different from just a non-faith-based institution?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And it's a really good question for me. I come from a faith background. Actually, when I was younger and first started college, I got very, very involved in church and evangelical non-denominational church here in Las Cruces. But after a few years, I kind of realized that, at least for me, it just wasn't something that was going to work for me, because unfortunately there are some areas and some faith traditions that don't always quite fit for folks, or see all the different ways that people might exist or be in the world. So for me as a gay man, that was something that was very difficult for me to actually walk away from for a while. And so it's been a really blessed and delightful kind of surprise for me, actually, in this work, to come into it and find that there are plenty of people from many different faith traditions, not just Christian faith traditions, who have a really strong orientation for social justice. And they very much see the need to, their faith informs everything from their eternity to the here and now, and the things that we might want to try to move and make better for people in the world here. So I would say that that's probably one of the more fundamental differences, is that for most folks who seek out faith-based organizations, especially justice-oriented organizations, there's this added spiritual element to this, where for many of us, we see that that this is actually part of a much bigger picture than just the world that we live in. But nevertheless, it's a picture that demands justice in our communities here. And we're very much strengthened by our faith and the tenets of our faith. And we're very able and willing to look at each other, even from different faith traditions, and find value in those things, and hopefully find ways that we can work together for a collective liberation for people in southern New Mexico.
That's terrific. Thank you very much for the explanation. What do you think the priorities for 2020 and during the pandemic are for New Mexico CAFé?
Sure. Yeah, and this is a bit of a difficult thing to land on, actually, because of the pandemic right now, right? When we talk about a lot of different areas of inequality that exist, so much of that is magnified right now because of the pandemic. Folks who were hurting before COVID are most likely hurting even more. And so it's difficult to try to pinpoint exactly where you can start. But for us, I think a lot of it comes through really just this faith lens and a political lens that wants to address poverty and structures of poverty that exist. New Mexico, unfortunately, we are all too often reminded of the fact that we rank 49th or 50th in so many different things. And most of that comes back to socioeconomic conditions for people in southern New Mexico. So much of what we want to be working on really has to do with those who have the least in our communities, actually. So what that means in more practical ways on the ground, I think a lot of it means economic reforms that we would like to see, everything from increases to minimum wage to things like paid sick leave, as well as just better economic opportunities as well. We see that the New Mexico economy, unfortunately, is so much of an extractive economy. It extracts both from the land in oil and gas, and it also extracts from people and ends up hurting a lot of people along the way. So while we realize the very serious reality that New Mexico has to pay its bills somehow, and one of the ways we do that now is through oil and gas revenues, we also see that it is just incredibly important that our people going forward in New Mexico are going to have more opportunities than just extractive industries, right? So we would like to see things like really building out renewable energy and a clean energy economy for New Mexico, as well as any other ways that we can find to provide better economic opportunities for people, better jobs, and better ways that we can potentially lift folks out of poverty. And I think one last point too that's important for us when we think about is places like New Mexico, unfortunately, are all too often subject to different types of quote unquote economic development that may not actually serve the interests of the people in our states. So I look at something like private prisons and private detention centers, for example, and those are often touted as economic drivers for communities. The reality is, and the data shows, that they're absolutely not. In fact, they hurt people, and they hurt people who are already hurting. They hurt poor people, immigrants, and so we'd really like to be working towards an economy in New Mexico that is much more moral and really allows for a lot more opportunity for people.
What would be some economic, what would be some industries that you would want to bring to New Mexico then?
Yeah, I think two of them that are really, really important for New Mexico CAFé, and we've been definitely working in these spaces, are the first one I mentioned is the area of renewable energy. So we see New Mexico, and I forget the exact rankings we are, but we're basically in the top, I believe, 5 for both sun and wind that just naturally occurs here. So New Mexico is an incredibly sunny place. And so it seems to be a perfect reason why we should really be wanting to build out our renewable energy economy for New Mexico and really rethinking energy policy for New Mexico. In addition to that, and because some of what we're seeing through data and studies that are being done on what this needs to look like for these industries to really have a chance to thrive in New Mexico, is that industries like renewable energy are not going to be able to stand alone. It's not a one-for-one trade-off with renewable energy from oil and gas, for example. So one of the other areas that is going to be really big for development as well in New Mexico is our outdoor economy, actually, and outdoor recreational spaces. So New Mexico CAFé was, last year, we were able to be a part of, in coalition with several other organizations around the state, in working to create the first ever for New Mexico Office of Outdoor Recreation, so that there is a hub for people in New Mexico, as well as for folks who would come visit New Mexico, to be able to find out what are all the treasures and outdoor spaces that exist for New Mexico. Because yeah, just a quick glance around, especially if you're in Las Cruces, we live in an incredibly beautiful, majestic place. And it's important for us, especially for us as an organization that is really led by people of color. It's important for us to also be able to claim that narrative that outdoor spaces and outdoor recreation are very important to all of us, and they're important to our heritage. I learned to be able to go out and be on the land and experience the land because of my grandparents and my father. And so that's another area that is really important for us. And obviously the economic benefits of that, I think, are going to be huge for New Mexico going forward.
Well, thank you very much. Let me ask you about, have the priorities been changed at all because of the pandemic, or just been emphasized?
Gosh, yeah, and that's a really good question, I think. Yeah, I would say, in speaking about priorities, it's still such a broad topic, this discussion about poverty in New Mexico. And so I would say that perhaps it's more that it's highlighted certain areas. Definitely one area, and it's been a big part of our work throughout the pandemic, has been just this realization, like I say, there were folks who were hurting before and they're hurting more now, particularly our immigrant community, and especially folks, undocumented immigrants in New Mexico, have basically been left out of all the different types of relief that people have been able to access, whether it's things like SNAP benefits, unemployment benefits, even just the COVID relief checks that were sent out to everyone. And so we've been able to work with other organizations to figure out different ways that we can try to fill those gaps, meet those needs for folks. Also with a very clear understanding, though, that these are also things that need to be addressed at a policy level as well, if folks are going to have a real chance at economic recovery. And it's important for people to know all over New Mexico that for us, it's clear as day, there will not be a recovery, economic or otherwise, from COVID if all of the people in New Mexico are not included in these types of relief. This is an ecosystem, and so everyone needs to be included in these discussions about relief.
Thank you very much. Let me get some specific issues that are occurring here and see what your take on them is as a representative of New Mexico CAFé. Let's talk about the whole issue that has come up with police brutality throughout the United States. And can you give us a Las Cruces slant on it, or a New Mexico slant on it?
Gosh, yeah, no, what a very current question, right, in discussion to ask. Yeah, I think on questions of police brutality, this is something I think a lot of social justice organizations for a long time, we have known that there are structural issues with law enforcement departments, issues of police brutality. I myself, as a young brown person, I wish I could tell you that those things haven't reared their ugly head in my life, but they have. And they have for a lot of folks, Black, brown, and really even white folks as well, working class white folks. Police departments, unfortunately, in many places, and I would even say including here in Las Cruces, they've been able to function for far too long with not nearly enough oversight. And so we've seen that happening in a lot of places. New Mexico CAFé happens to be a part of a much larger network, actually, called Faith in Action. Faith in Action is the largest network of faith-based social justice organizations throughout the country. And so we are all independent organizations doing our own work, but we work together as a network. And so last year, about a year ago, actually, I was able to go to Ferguson, Missouri, in St. Louis, to go and meet with organizers who were on the ground there when Michael Brown was shot, and all of the protests and things that happened there. And so these are some of the moments where it becomes very clear to us in our work that the fight here against police brutality or racism or even white supremacy in New Mexico is actually the same fight as it is in Minnesota or Missouri or California or anywhere. That's actually something that we're all very clear about, is the solidarity that we move with throughout the country. And so the work is actually going to look a little bit differently depending on where you go, but the fights are the same. And I think because of that, one of the things that it's really impressed upon us here in New Mexico, as organizers and people of color ourselves, is that it is vitally important that we are addressing not just issues of police brutality, but even issues of racism and anti-Blackness that might exist in New Mexico, and anti-Blackness that might even exist within the Latino community as well. These are discussions that are really important for us to have, to talk about what they mean, and because we need to do that in order for us to have that true solidarity with each other, so that I'll never forget, I met an organizer who organizes out in Chicago last year. And there was a moment where he stopped in the middle of the training and he let everybody know. He says, guys, we don't have time to waste. He says, they got kids in cages right now. And this was a Black man who had been incarcerated who shared this with us. And it was so powerful for me to hear that moment of solidarity, that he cares about little kids who look like I did when I was 5 years old, who are in cages right now. And that's the reason why it's so important for me to care about mass incarceration all over this country, especially in places where Black folks are being locked up in just horrific numbers.
That's a powerful statement. Thank you very much. Are you involved at all with the census? And are you concerned about how the census is being conducted?
Sure, and I'm glad you asked about that, Gary. Census work, for me in particular, actually has been a huge part of my work life for the last few months. So coming into this year, we had already identified how important it is that we get an accurate count of all the people living in communities in New Mexico. New Mexico has, for really historically, has tried to make do with less resources, because we've traditionally, historically, we've undercounted people all over New Mexico, especially in rural communities and especially in immigrant communities. So for New Mexico CAFé, outreach work has been really important for us to do, to talk to people about the importance of the census, about the importance of getting counted, and hopefully we're a bit more of a trusted messenger for folks in our communities than governmental entities and so on, to where they'll be willing a little bit more to listen to us when we say this is why it's important, and this is why you don't need to be afraid of sharing your information when you do that. So to date, I was looking at the numbers this morning. New Mexico CAFé has reached out. We've made over 22,000 phone calls since the beginning of March, all throughout southern New Mexico, talking to people about the importance of the census. One of the things that is really concerning to me right now is that just over the last few days, we've found out that there will be a curtailing of the amount of time that folks have to complete the census. It was going to go until the end of October. Because of all the pandemic and the different changes that have come about, they had extended it all the way till the end of October. Unfortunately, now they've shortened that to be the end of September. So that's going to make it very difficult for us to continue trying to get a full count of everyone, especially in some of the counties we work in, particularly Luna and Hidalgo County, where the digital divide is huge. There isn't nearly enough access to internet or other types of technology that people could utilize to hear about the census and to be able to complete the census. And so it's very concerning, very important to us that we continue doing work in those areas to let people know. And most recently, I can send you the link for this as well, Gary, but there will be a commercial that will start airing later this week that New Mexico CAFé and some of our leaders who have been making those phone calls and talking to people about the census, they were in this commercial in Spanish to help people know all throughout southern New Mexico about how important it is that they get counted.
That's fascinating. I did not know about that change in the deadline. Do you have any other issues that you're dealing with beyond the census and policing right now?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the first one that comes to mind amongst many others that we could potentially be working on, but in particular, actually, New Mexico CAFé is all about civic engagement and democracy. Ultimately, the way that we view our work is that it's about plugging people into the process, especially the people who have all too often been left out of the processes. People who haven't normally participated in government, maybe they haven't voted before, maybe they don't know who their elected officials are. So the work that we will actually shift into after we complete our census work is we will actually shift into election work and civic engagement outreach work. So New Mexico, as we mentioned, New Mexico CAFé is a 501c3, so we do not tell people who to vote for, who not to vote for. In fact, I'm rather happy that that's not part of my job. I don't think that I need to tell people who are directly impacted by bad government who or what they need to vote for. They can decide those things for themselves. My job, and if I'm doing it correctly, is to help get those folks connected and plugged in so that they can have the analysis. We deeply believe at New Mexico CAFé that the vision for something new in New Mexico and even beyond, is that vision is held by the people on the ground who are directly impacted by government, not even necessarily me or our director. Our job is to actually set the stage for those folks to be able to tell government what needs to really happen so that people can be seen, so that they don't go hungry at night, so that they have a job that pays them a living wage, that treats them with dignity. And so those are the types of discussions that we're excited to engage in with voters all across southern New Mexico, as they prepare to go into the voting booths. Obviously, we also want to talk to them about how they can make sure they're registered to vote, where they go vote, the dates and deadlines and all those kinds of important things that go along with it. But that will make up a large part of our work here going forward. And New Mexico CAFé, we are always using these opportunities to engage in deeper discussions with people on the ground to see, in 2021, New Mexico will have a 60-day legislative session. Unfortunately, our legislature is very limited. It's very, really is very handcuffed in a lot of ways in its ability to be able to provide for people in New Mexico. So when we see that we have a 60-day legislative session coming up in 2021, those are definitely the kinds of things that we want to be gearing up for as well. And again, this is how we can get people plugged into the process to know exactly who are the people they need to be talking to. And we'll know exactly how we can talk to them in a way that hopefully they're going to listen to us and say, yes, these are the kinds of things that need to happen to build a moral economy that really treats people with dignity.
Do you have any programs focused on youth in high schools or colleges?
Yeah. Gosh, you know, I really wish we could build out even more so specific programs that would address those types of things. Really what we try to do, Gary, is we're often trying to, our executive director, I think she says it well when she says that young people in southern New Mexico are searching for a political home, actually. And so that's an idea that we very much run with. So we do try often to concentrate our efforts on younger people, especially because I believe that young people of color, and the numbers show this when you look at the number of young people of color, and even just young people in general, who don't want to register to vote with a major political party. They may not even want to register to vote at all. And that's not because they don't care about their government. It's because they've actually felt the sting their entire lives of a government that doesn't seem to care about them. And so those are the types of conversations we often want to be having with young people. And so hopefully what that means is that we will continue to, as we do now, we work a lot with young people, especially college age people, but we'd like to see that built out a lot more. And in fact, the civic engagement campaign that we will be working on, as I mentioned, for voting and get out the vote efforts, we will very much be having a certain amount of focus, at least, on younger people of color, low-income backgrounds. Like I say, all those folks, we approach government in the same way that, at least for us from the Christian faith tradition, that we're taught that government should seek to provide for those, the least of us. And that's actually how we approach everything, including civic engagement.
Okay, that's terrific. Okay, so coming for 2020 and 2021, what do you believe your primary role will be? Is it essentially the census and then building out from there, or something else?
Yeah, I think the priority is the same. Really, it's looking at everything and approaching everything from an anti-poverty policy standpoint. And so everything, even when it comes to census or our civic engagement work with voting, or rural economic development, or all of these things that we've been talking about, all of these things are really with the idea of trying to identify, you know, for a lot of nonprofit organizations, and CAFé is one of them, we do have an area of our work that is has to do with charitable work and direct services for people, but we very deeply believe that charity work can never, or at least should never, really function on its own. In fact, in so many ways, unfortunately, that will just continue to recycle some of the different dynamics that you see in communities, especially impoverished communities. What is absolutely important and integral and inevitably connected to all of this is actual anti-poverty policy work that needs to happen as well. And so that's a lot of what New Mexico CAFé will be working on, whether it has to do directly with our immigrant community or undocumented folks, or even just minimum wage workers, tipped wage workers, or even people who live in rural communities where there aren't a lot of opportunities. All of these things are really approached from that anti-poverty standpoint.
Gotcha. Are there opportunities to volunteer for New Mexico CAFé? And if people listening to this interview wanted to receive more information, how would they receive it?
Sure.
How would they get it?
It's a great question. And if anyone hears what I've been talking about, especially when I talk about this, this orientation to justice and policy work, actually. So New Mexico CAFé, I often tell people, you know, I was involved in a church for a very long time where I did volunteer work, right? Everything from stacking chairs and serving plates of food and things like that. And all those things are vitally important. Those things are always going to be there. But anyone who's listening to this, if you're interested in volunteer work, don't worry about that. I'll stack chairs and serve food. Really the work that we're often asking people is if they'd actually like to get engaged and plug into their community, if they would like to build political power, if they would like to pursue justice. That's what volunteering for New Mexico CAFé actually looks like, is that we believe wholeheartedly that justice is what faith looks like in the public square. And so that's what we would ask folks to bring, is bring yourself, your story, your faith. Or even if you're not a part of a faith tradition, that's absolutely fine as well. But if you want to jump in, dig into the work of social justice and what it looks like to advocate for that, to go and approach power and tell them this is what real people need, that's actually what volunteer work looks like for New Mexico CAFé. And it's my hope and my prayer all the time that folks will latch onto that and say, yes, let's do that. Let's lock arms. It's all of us or none of us. And we want to definitely be involved in the decision making. We want to co-govern with our elected officials.
Abraham, I want to thank you greatly from the owners and staff and volunteer staff of our Las Cruces. I'm a new resident of Las Cruces in New Mexico. I'm originally a Coloradoan, and I spent 31 years on the East Coast. Most of my career was in nonprofit organizations. What you're sort of speaking to me as part of your choir. I think I want to call you later and talk about volunteering for your organization. I think it's a fantastic one. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you. Welcome to New Mexico. I look forward to chatting with you more about these things.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.